To all who come to this happy place, welcome. Disneyland is your land.
Where did you originally get the first notion for Disneyland?
Well, it came about when my daughters were very young, and Saturday was always Daddy's Day with the two daughters. So we'd start out and try to go someplace with, different things, and I would take them to the merry-go-round, and I took them different places, and as I'd sit there while they rode the merry-go-round, did all these things, sit on a bench, eating peanuts, I felt that there should be something built, some kind of an amusement enterprise built where the parents and the children could have fun together.
Walter Elias Disney and his older brother Roy Oliver Disney started their company back in 1923. In those times it was known as the Disney Brothers Studio, and then later renamed to Walt Disney Productions. Today it is known simply as the Walt Disney Company. The stories and characters they created had become world famous, and tourists who flocked to Hollywood wanted to visit the Disney studios in hopes of finding something magical. But Walt's studio was nothing more than ordinary offices and sound stages surrounded by well-tended lawns and rose gardens. He needed something that could buffer their disappointment. In the early 1940s, he thought of a themed corner of the studio where visitors could meet their favorite characters, but this project eventually grew into an idea for an 11-acre park across the street. In the early 1950s, Walt had been offering rides on his backyard live steam railroad in Holmby Hills, California, and the sheer number of visitors the railroad received prompted him to consider that Little Mickey Mouse Park idea more seriously. Roy Disney, who was CEO of the company, was skeptical about opening an amusement park. Even Walt's wife Lillian had said, "Why would you want that? Amusement parks are so dirty and dangerous." Walt simply responded, "That's just it, mine wouldn't be." Reluctantly, Roy agreed to set aside money for research, and Lillian conceded to go along with it. In early 1953, Imagineer Harper Goff explained to Walt that the current designs of the park exceeded the 11-acre land parcel across from the studio. It wasn't until Burbank City Council denied his request to build an amusement park that Walt finally admitted it was time to look for land in a different place. To get financial backing, Roy knew a pile of papers with descriptions of the park were not enough to make a convincing pitch, so he asked Walt to have artwork commissioned that helped potential financiers to visualize the concept. He turned around and called upon one of his studio's best artists, Herb Ryman, to create the rendering of the park over the weekend. Herb said no. "Well, I'm only just seeing these plans. I don't want to create an embarrassment for you or me."
And he went over and stood in the corner, and he kind of turned around and looked at me, and he said, "Will you do it if I stay here with you?" So, of course, Walt, as you know, was a very persuasive person.
The two of them worked throughout the weekend to generate the first image of the park that Walt would later name Disneyland, a name that Ryman lightheartedly joked had sounded somewhat egotistical. The artwork depicted the park with 4 themed lands: a jungle area to represent the land of adventure, a futuristic city to represent the land of tomorrow, an Old West town complete with a river boat to represent the frontier, and a large medieval forecourt with a fairy tale castle to act as the park's visual icon. This represented the land of fantasy, complete with a carousel to pay homage to the idea that started it all. And surrounding the park would be a miniature railroad that would surpass any steam train hobbyist's greatest dream. Roy made arrangements for Walt Disney Productions to allot $10,000 towards the research and development of Disneyland. But when Walt needed more money, Roy suggested he create a private company that would own the rights to Walt Disney's name. That way he could license the name out to Walt Disney Productions, giving him weekly funding for the project. And so, Walt created Retlaw Enterprises in the year 1950. It was the name Walter spelled backwards, and by licensing his own name to the bigger company, he received a weekly income of $3,000. Walt hired an architectural firm to design his park, but wasn't satisfied with their concepts. He turned to his friend for advice, the famed architect Welton Beckett. He reviewed Walt's ideas for fanciful architecture built from modern materials. "Walt, no one can design Disneyland for you. We don't have that kind of background for this," Beckett said. "You have to use your own people." To build his Magic Kingdom, Walt needed complete control. He didn't want Walt Disney Productions' board of directors voting or vetoing his ideas before they came to fruition. In 1952, he created Walt Disney Incorporated, which was quickly renamed to WED Enterprises the next year. WED stood for the initials Walter Elias Disney, and it was his newly dubbed team of Imagineers at WED Enterprises that would dream up all of the future things that would go into Disneyland. While Roy was able to get some financial backers, such as Bank of America, he still wasn't having much luck. Walt called around to various television studios, offering that they could help fund his park in exchange for him starring in a television series he simply called Disneyland. Until then, he continued borrowing money to help pay for the development of his park. He took out $50,000 from his life insurance and then sold his Palm Springs vacation home. When his wife Lillian found out he had spent over $100,000 of their money, she was livid. Walt reminded her that when the park would finally open, Lillian and her daughters would receive a 15% return on any merchandise that visitors bought with his name on it. Still, Lily feared that his plan would only work if the park would open, which seemed increasingly